Artistic influences are such an intimate affair. For the longest time, I've been pretty faithful to the English Romantics, the Modernists, the stuffy Victorians, and it's taken me almost 20 years to get to Calvino. I started flirting with form and content because of this dude. So tonight you'll be hearing something completely new. It's not quite finished. It's an essay strongly influenced by both Calvino and Robert MacFarlane, who is a nature writer, writing about the wild places of Britain. So I'm going to read two pieces, one from each, and then a really short essay influenced by both of them. So the first one, Calvino, which is a short story from his Cosmocomics, The Distance of the Moon. Transparent medusas rose to the sea's surface, throbbed there a moment, then flew off, swaying toward the moon. Little X amused herself by catching them in midair, though it wasn't easy. Once, as she stretched her little arms out to catch one, she jumped up slightly and also was set free. Thin as she was an ounce or two short of the weight necessary for the Earth's gravity to overcome the moon's attraction and bring her back. So she flew up among the medusas, suspended over the sea. She took fright, cried, then laughed and started playing, catching shellfish and minnows as they flew, sticking some into her mouth and chewing them. We rowed hard to keep up with the child. The moon ran off in her ellipse, dragging that swarm of marine fauna through the sky, and a train of long entwined seaweeds, and X hanging there in the midst. Her two wispy braids seemed to be flying on their own, outstretched toward the moon. But all the while she kept wriggling and kicking at the air as if she wanted to fight that influence in her socks. She had lost her shoes in the flight, slipped off her feet and swayed, attracted by the Earth's force. On the ladder we tried to grab them. The idea of eating the little animals in the air had been a good one. The more weight X gained, the more she sank toward the Earth. In fact, since among those hovering bodies, hers was the largest, mollusks and seaweeds and plankton began to gravitate about her, and soon the child was covered with silicious little cells, chitinous carapaces, and fibers of sea plants. And the farther she vanished into that tangle, the more she was freed of the moon's influence, until she grazed the surface of the water and sank into the sea. We rowed quickly to pull her out and save her. Her body had remained magnetized, and we had to work hard to scrape off all the things encrusted on her. Tender corals were wound about her head, and every time we ran the comb through her hair, there was a shower of crayfish and sardines. Her eyes were sealed shut by limpets, clinging to the lids with their suckers. Squid's tentacles were coiled around her arms and her neck, and her little dress now seemed woven only of weeds and sponges. We got the worst of it off her, but for weeks afterwards she went on pulling out fins and shells, and her skin dotted with little diatoms remained affected forever, looking to someone who didn't observe her carefully, as if it were faintly dusted with freckles. This should give you an idea of how the influences of Earth and Moon, practically equal, fought over the space between them. I'll tell you something else. A body that descended to the Earth from the satellite was still charged for a while with lunar force and rejected the attraction of our world. Even I, big and heavy as I was, every time I had been up there, I took a while to get used to the Earth's up and its down, and the others would have to grab my arms and hold me clinging in the bunch of the swaying boat, while I still had my head hanging and my legs stretching up toward the sky. So that's Calvino, fiction. And then moving from that to nonfiction, but still kind of keeping with the natural world. So this is Robert MacFarlane on Holloways, and he explains what Holloways are. So the oldest Holloways date back to the early Iron Age. None is younger than 300 years old. Over the course of centuries, the passage of cartwheels, hooves, and feet wore away at the floor of these roads, grooving ruts into the exposed stone. As the roads deepened, they became natural waterways. Rain drained into and down them, storms turned them into temporary rivers, sluicing away the loose rock debris and cutting the road still further below the meadows and the fields. Holloways do not exist on the unyielding rock regions of the archipelago where the roads and paths stay high, riding the hard surface of the ground. But in the soft stone countries of southern England, in the chalk of Kent, Wiltshire, and East Anglia, and the yellow sandstone of Dorset and Somerset, in the green sand of Surrey, and in the malmstone of Hampshire and Sussex, many Holloways are to be found, some of them 20 feet deep, more ravine than road. They go by different names in different regions, bostels, grundles, shoots, but they are most usually known as Holloways. These Holloways are humbling, for they are landmarks that speak of habit rather than suddenness, trodden by innumerable feet, cut by innumerable wheels. They are the records of journeys to market, to worship, to see, like creases in the hand or the wear on the stone sill of a doorstep or stair. They are the consequence of tradition, of repeated action, like old trees, the details of whose spiraling and kinked branches indicate the wind history of a region, and whose growth rings record each year's richness or poverty of sun. They archive the customs of a place. Their age chastens without crushing. So that was MacFarlane. And hopefully you can see how I've moved from Calvino to MacFarlane to an essay about water. And it's titled Waters I've Known right now. So it's a really rough draft. Don't quite have an ending yet. We'll see where we go from here. So waters I've known. We sip from the stars, this blue marble fed by interstellar ice, water springing from the void, launched from one stellar system to another, packed as frozen cometary time capsules composed of gas, dust, and ice before the sun had ever formed. Our seas, lakes, and rivers come from a cold molecular cloud, once ions and ices fused in frigid chemistry predating the sun. Our interstellar heritage comes from a family line bearing names like Halley, Hale-Bopp, and lunar apatite. There are the comet-asteroid hybrids known as Centaurs 60558 and 166P neat. Our seas have traveled far, spanning millions of years from the Kuiper Belt or the scattered disk or beyond the reaches of Neptune's orbit, and even going further back to the Oort cloud. We sip from the stars, our bodies nourished by lunar basalts and Martian melt. At our shores lap the detritus of solar nebula. Along our coastlines and bays wash up the particles of cosmic rays and meteorites. I live on a plate boundary, where the Pacific and North American transform, gliding and crashing together to form the mountain ranges, the rugged continental crags, the rolling hills and desert valleys that have mapped my family history and my life. My brother, my cousin, and myself used to ride the waves along this boundary, paddling at beaches called Pacific, La Jolla, and Mission. Childhood summers were spent hands getting pruny, letting our brown bodies darken under the hot borderland sun. We came home with the roar of the surf still crashing within us, salt water plugging up our ears and sand crusting our ankles and in between our toes. We were rocked to sleep at night with the phantom swell and surge of the ocean. When I look to the west now, there's a different kind of salty bitterness I can taste from the sea. The ocean may go by the same name, but here in the Bay Area, age and latitude has complicated the affair I once shared. The Pacific here is a changeling. Swells are bigger and break with an anger unmatched. The waters have a polar temperament. In the 9 years I have lived east of the bay, I must have dipped a foot into its tide at most a half dozen times. Shaping itself into a spectral figure, the water haunts the Golden Gate and hovers over that shining city across the harbor, where we are now, spanning over to the hills and flatlands I now call home. These days I'm more inclined to paddle the estuaries and marinas where the fresh water rushes off to meet the salty mass. Inland waters fed by rivers like the San Joaquin and Sacramento trace back to where my parents were born. From the valleys that feed the nation and world, my mother grew up on the Delta. She calls herself an island girl, a much different kind of island than the archipelago of 7,000 plus isles where her parents traveled from. There are waters handed down one generation after another, ancestral waters known by story and seen only through faded photos in a threadbare album. That same Pacific which glows cold and frosts my windows, making water bead along the pane, is also the very ocean that tosses the sands of Limasawa, where my maternal grandfather said he could dip a hand into its cool, clear drink and scoop up fish like plucking fruit from a tree. It is the same ocean that raised down my maternal grandmother's birthplace, Playa del Bye in Leyte, where Typhoon Yolanda swallowed the earth whole only 2 years ago. There are waters I have traveled to and only known briefly. The snow of New Hampshire that froze my fingers and iced my nose inside out. The warm bath of Sonora shores in the Indian Ocean of Bali. The silk seduction of Hanalei and Mauna Kea. The swift, cold, constant crush of the River Esk, which I used to chase for a month in Scotland. The choppy plunge of the Irish Sea that incited the worst kind of vertigo I've ever known. The ice chill of Portugal's Atlantic and the searing blue of the Adriatic. Of all the waters I've come to know, the most intimate seems most foreign. There is an ocean inside of me, a seascape within. This tiny universe understood only by sensate means, a push here, a kick and punch there, some constant thumping at the bottom of my belly, and a rise near my breastbone that aches in the strangest of ways. Contained in my own and taut and overstretched skin, I sometimes feel I may burst at the swells and surge of this sea that startles with life inside. It wakes me up at night with a roll, a flutter or swish, and reminds me at the most surprising moments when I sit at my desk or soak dishes at the sink that my body is not my own, and perhaps never really was. 6 months into this 9-month journey since ventured, the most basic elements of who I am and who I have been are forever altered, combined inextricably with my partner. The tiniest parts of self biologically fuse to create something altogether new, and we wait with anxious excitement, missing this being we both know and don't know. Thank you.